So today would have been Philthy Animal Taylor, the late great Philthy Animal Taylor would have been his 71st birthday today. He was born on 21st September 1954. He died 10 years ago. I think he was 61 when he of basically I think liver failure, and he had an aneurysm and stuff. I think it was a few years of living the rock and roll lifestyle caught up with him, as it were, as is generally the case. But yeah, there's been an adult celebration of him on social media and stuff to mark his birthday. But I just thought I'd do a little video on Motörhead drummers generally, but especially concentrating around the Animal, because it's always this comment I see. It's like wasn't technically the greatest drummer, but had so much charisma. Or so I was just like, what world do these people live in? I mean, I'm not a drummer, but when I listen to like Overkill, imagine that coming out in '79. I mean, I've played with great drummers, and myself, I remember one drummer, he was trying to do that, and he was a brilliant drummer, just a single bass drum, and he got a double bass thing, just the one bass drum, but two pedals, had two hammers on the one drum. And he tried to do it, he couldn't hold the beat at all. Anything else was a doddle for him. Yeah, it seems to be like the sort of fashionable thing to say. It was like, wasn't the greatest technical drummer. It's like, I don't see how that can be true, especially compared to the other Motörhead drummers. But they also say, I would say the original was best, which is, of course, not true. As Lucas Fox was the first drummer, and I mean, he's active on social media. I've exchanged a few comments, or asked him a few questions. Actually, I said to him, was it true, Lucas, if I may call you that, was it true you were the one that picked up Lemmy from Heathrow when he got fired from Hawkwind and he came back to America? He said, yeah, that was me. I said, did he discuss forming Motörhead then, and like in the car on the way back from Heathrow to, Shepherd's Bush or wherever they were? And he said, no, he was just deeply pissed off. He said, just get me to the boozer. But it's fascinating. I said to him, you should write a book. You really should write a book. I've seen him being interviewed, but set this stuff down. It's gold. The real early days. But definitely it deserves his place as legend. He was part of the boys starting the whole thing off. But the best one in the world, I mean, he held the beat. He was a beat holder. He held the beat, But Lemmy said in his White Line Fever, he was obviously good mates with Lucas Fox, but he said he just didn't have the bite. I think he tried to keep up for Lemmy. Very misty, this video. It's like misty. Anyway, he said he tried to keep up for Lemmy's drug habit or the speed habit. So no chance. He said he just didn't have the bite, and then Philthy Animal came along, who obviously had the bite in spades, to coin a phrase, pun intended, whatever it is. And it came along, and the classic lineup got going. Well, I think it was then first that he joined the second guitarist for a very short, I think, one rehearsal, if that, and then they became the classic three piece. But getting back to the drums was one thing that Mickey D has held up. Mickey D himself has said, Philthy Animal Taylor is not a good drummer at all, but hell of a character. He was talking about Pete Gill, obviously followed after Phil Taylor, then Phil Taylor again, and then Mickey D. Mickey D was talking about Phil Taylor compared to Pete Gill. He said Pete Gill, wonderful drummer. He said, what's it, charisma of a plant pot. Phil Taylor, charisma in spades. A very mediocre drummer. Anyway, I'm not a drummer, and opinions, and if anyone can have the opinion, is Mickey D. But hats off to Mickey D for keeping the Motörhead machine going. Brilliant drummer, obviously. Best drummer in the world, as Lemmy called him. But the one thing that I always missed with, just when they played the older tracks, was the way sort of Mickey D would kind of bludgeon them. Phil Taylor had that wonderful thing. I've heard a few stories. He said he was quite into jazz records when he was young, practicing by himself, and that's where he got the thing from, the sort of swing thing. And but then I've also heard that when he kept getting done for fighting and stuff. He was quite an angry young man, and his father said, I've paid for you to have some drum lessons, go and hit drums instead of another human being or something. But he's got that wonderful story for him of going to this place, like, oh bloody, I don't want to do this. But it was a 90-year-old man teaching the drums, and this guy had been in the First World War. I think he'd been a drummer boy in the First World War. Or maybe it was just a soldier. Maybe I've got that bit wrong. But anyway, he was a veteran. And Phil Taylor kind of sort of fell in line. I think this guy sort of put him on the straight and narrow. And after he says, you have some natural talent here, Philip, you should continue. And he thought, oh, all right. But I also read that he picked up that thing off him, that thing. And especially stuff like Love Me Like a Reptile. When they played that afterwards with Mickey D, and I love that song off the Ace of Spades album when the Three Piece did it. And I just, Mickey D just bludgeoned that song for me. There's a few others that don't come to mind, the titles right now. I think the stuff with the Robbo era as well. Like, Come On Lover, I Got Mine. That one as well. Mickey D was fantastic with the later stuff, and well, the stuff, most of it. But some tracks, he as I say, he bludgeoned them to me. He didn't have the swing, that little thing. And then Pete Gill, it's just Mickey D said personality of a plot pot, and I think Lemmy said he started out as a hell of a guy. He said he was drinking heavily already, and then he drank even more heavily after he joined us. But then he stopped and became this born again drummer, jogger, and he was quite boring after that. And there's those weird stories about how he left. They told complete. Pete Gill said I was really professional, and Lemmy was always late and dragging his feet and mucking about, and he got pissed off of it and he left. And Lemmy said Pete Gill was always like deliberately sort of just doing things way too slowly and stuff. There was a head-to-head one outside the hotel one morning, and they both told Esso from completely different things. Lemmy wouldn't come. Pete Gill said Lemmy took ages to come down from his room, and everyone was being kept waiting. And Lemmy told exactly the same, the other way around. It was Pete Gill. So that's how it blew up. But they had 3 or 4 years together. Pete Gill, a really powerful drummer. The only thing I found live with Pete Gill, which something people don't seem to pick up on, he seemed to make a number of mistakes. He'd keep trying to stop the song and then realise it. He quickly started drumming again. Brilliant drummer, but I've heard that a few times. It's very noticeable on the birthday party, but it could be excused that Lemmy was not into rehearsing, and they'd been off stage for ages. I think there was a 1985 birthday party that they didn't want to release for ages. Excuse me as I wipe myself. So they didn't rehearse. Maybe that was it. But I've heard it on a few live tracks as well, on compilations and stuff. The rolls were sometimes off and stuff. It could be a bit nitpicking, but I've heard it a few times. But generally speaking, a great, powerful drummer. Played on the one album, Orgasmatron. Then of course Philthy joined again on the sleeve notes of rock and rolls. Welcome home, Philthy. And was it, by the way, if you had a face like mine, I'd punch you straight on the nose or something, some weird thing. Phil had left Motörhead. He wanted to go off with Robbo, and he kind of thought they could do something more varied than the Motörhead thing, but in the end it didn't work out, so he came back to Motörhead. And Phil and Lemmy said I gave him his job back, and I shouldn't have done, because he was only doing it for wages after that. And they played till I think 92, 87 to 91 or 92. I think he was doing the demos for March or Die after 1916, absolutely brilliant 1916. But he said by then, they were having to put Phil Taylor on a metronome, which I don't. Why is that a big deal? I thought most drummers are on a metronome when you record, that tick, tick, tick thing in your ear, so you keep time. But they said he couldn't play Overkill, and he'd start songs off really fast, and then by the end he'd be knackered. And they were trying to demo the tracks for March or Die. Lemmy was still in LA. And they got together with Philthy Phil and Wurzel and Phil Campbell, and they started to play the demos. But after a couple of tracks, Phil Campbell said to me, "You don't know these fucking tracks, do you?" And they'd all had a tape to learn from. And Phil, it's just just after Christmas. Apparently Phil Taylor said, no. They said, well, why not? You know, we've all learnt them. And Phil Taylor said, oh, my Walkman broke over Christmas. So we kind of had to go. But it's really sad after that. I think I've heard from a number of sources that he got into, so we say, the party scene after being kicked out of Motörhead. And he said himself, he'd be interviewed, he said, they say, why didn't you join other bands? You know, such a good drummer and that. He said, I always had this feeling I'd already done it. And it's so true. How do you leave a band like, or get thrown out of a band like Motörhead and do something else? And he said, I'd already done it. Everything else was like a pale imitation. So there was nothing that held any appeal. And it seems to me that really, arguably, the only person to me that ever sort of did anything after their career in Motörhead was Faster D. Clark with Fastway. And even he said to his dying day, he said, I never got over, he was quite open about it, he said, I never got over being thrown out of Motörhead. As he said, he got thrown out, the other said he left, well, you know, whatever. He said, I never got over being thrown out of Motörhead. But he said, I shouldered the bag of sorrow. Those are his words exactly. And I met Fast Eddie. He was in a band managed by him, as I endlessly dine out on. And he had some stories. Those, but he was very open about it. He said, I never got over it. But he said, so he said, I shouldered the bag of sorrow. I always remember those words. But he said, Phil Taylor, he said, there was a man who never got over being fired by Lemmy. He said he was bitter and twisted to the end. And this was Fast Eddie, one of his closest friends, saying it. I think Phil Taylor got sick, he had the aneurysm, and he came over from the States, and he stayed with Fast Eddie for a while. He said, you know, they saved his life with the operation, but he was slower and he aged, you know, 20, 30 years. But then I think he was still in his 50s, but he was quite almost doddery. You see him get on stage towards the end of his life, a few Motörhead shows when Lemmy was starting to get sick as well. And you could tell Phil, he was so, you know, witty and quick and stuff, and fiery tempered and blah, blah, blah. And it's like something, you know, well, he had a bloody brain operation, of course. But there's an interview, I think from 2010, he's being interviewed by his guys in this apartment, and he's chewing gum like super fast. And everyone says, you know, that's the speed. And at the end, he just loses his temper. He doesn't get nasty, but he's just, you know, it was, say, like how he started to play the drums, and he tells a story about the World War I veteran who teaches him. And then the interviewer says, you know, so did you go on to be inspired by other drummers? So I was like, no, I listen to fucking trombone players, you know, or worse to that effect. And at the end, he just gets completely exasperated for another similar boneheaded question, and does this very odd routine of a German trying to light his own farts, it looks like to me. So he's obviously completely nutty up to when he had the problem with his head. That was Phil, you know, Phil Taylor. I mean, I did want to base around Phil Taylor, but and to Mickey D, invaluable, you know, obviously fantastic, brilliant drummer. I mean, my minor personal gripes, other Motörhead fans to talk to, don't know what I'm talking about. They're like, what's the problem? Like, I couldn't listen to the way he does, like Fast and Loose, that's another one, and Love Me Like a Reptile. The older stuff, the newer stuff with him on the albums, fine, great, and he certainly saved the band to an extent. He was a very stabilising influence, Mickey D. He said he also started to look into the business stuff. And Lemmy was always like, oh, he's got this massive ego, like I have. Lemmy would say, like I have, to be fair. But I think you'd need it to be in Motörhead and to keep your head. And he said also when he joined, there was a lot of flack, like people going, who is this bloke? You know, look at him, he loves himself. Back in his youth, he was 30 when he joined, a young guy and extremely good looking and kind of full of himself. But you'd have to be to take on a gig of that size. And he it was really great. And towards the end of Lemmy's life, when he couldn't get off, he couldn't stop doing the shows, even though he was so sick. And you see him and Phil really working to try and support Lemmy, because that was his life, and he still wanted to do it, even though he could barely stand. So hats off to him. As I say, my minor gripes aside, what does it matter? But obviously, technically, in that. Mickey D probably is the best drummer that Motörhead, well, almost certainly is the best drummer that Motörhead had, but I don't think there's this world of difference between him and Philthy Animal Taylor, especially when it's Looking back, it was still like the tail end of the 70s, probably 78 when they were demoing Overkill. I mean, absolutely groundbreaking, revolutionary stuff. And people say it was that track in particular that it boosted Motörhead from being some sort of ground level punk rock, hard rock, pub rock, whatever you want to call it, act, which they arguably were in 78. Listen to them in 78 compared to 79, and it's Philthy Animal Taylor's drums as much as, you know, Lemmy's bass or the growl or whatever that was making Motörhead completely different to anything else. And that's, you know, that's just my little take there on the Motörhead drummers on what would have been Philthy Animal Taylor's 71st birthday. Rest in peace, and thank you for the music to all the Motörhead members that are now gone, and thank you to the ones still living. And I shall end it there.